Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Hope Health Communication, where two Black moms, researchers, and hope seekers come together to bring you real talk, trusted resources, and community wisdom.
Hi, everybody. And we know that raising a family takes a village, and we're here to be a part of yours, sharing hopeful messages, expert insights, and tools you may need for your family's wellness, growth, and joy. So, welcome to another podcast. We have our amazing guest today, Dr. Turpin, who is a colleague and has become a friend. And we're so honored to sit down with someone who brings both personal wisdom and professional insight into today's conversation. And so, Rod, we can't wait to hear more about, your research, your lived experiences, and any other kind of real talk you want to bring to the conversation today. So please introduce yourself, and we're so happy to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, I'm very happy to be here. So, I'm Rod Turpin. I'm an assistant professor at George Mason University, and my area is HIV and STI health among particularly Black queer men through a social and intersectional lens. So, much of that is focused on PrEP use right now. My primary research project is a intervention focused on increasing PrEP use, access, and uptake in this population. And I do take that lens of, and I take a lens that's very community focused in that. So I think that's really informed a lot of my work, as I've kind of made this journey through academia and such. Yes.
And what a journey it is, right?
Oh, indeed.
Yes, Lord, a couple bumps and bruises and hurdles and all types on that journey. No, like Rochelle said, welcome. We really appreciate you being here. So we'll get right into the conversation, and I wanted to start out by asking you a question about your journey in particular, or identity that's shaped how you see the world today. So what has in that experience, what has shaped how you view the world?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because I think my personal identity and my professional identity kind of converged in a certain way.
Mhm.
Where professionally, I kind of started off in the more medical or biomedical side of things, doing hospital work and clinical work around infectious disease, gaining interest in HIV.
Mhm.
And I think what I saw very early on was, okay, we have many of these great biomedical advancements and whatnot, but there's still all of these issues around healthcare access and uptake that a lot of the biomedical side isn't addressing on its own, especially when it comes to HIV prevention amongst, Black queer men. And, on the personal side, kind of growing up as, a Black queer man in the DC metropolitan area,
Mhm.
when I think of, my own experiences and my friendships and whatnot, it some of the social challenges when it came to how we navigate healthcare in particular really started to, made me think, oh, well, yeah, the issue isn't that, there aren't enough, we don't have enough PrEP necessarily, or like we're not enough
Mhm.
of it, but it's so difficult to access, or,
Mhm.
it's so difficult to find a doctor who, is going to have an honest conversation with you about it.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
think that that's what really started to inform me going into the social side of research, which is where, I've landed and really started to thrive. But yeah, definitely more than anything, it really helped inform the community aspect of my work because my work is intra-community work. So,
Mhm.
it's very focused on, community serving organizations. And a big part of that is, these are, they're both professional organizations and they're serving the community and whatnot. But in many cases, these are also my friends. This
Mhm.
is my
Yeah.
people. And it definitely changes the way I look at this.
Mhm.
Sure.
Absolutely. I mean, and you think about like that positions, those sort of intersectional positions that you hold as an academic, as a community leader, as someone who's the bridge between academia and what's happening in the community. What are some of the stories that you've heard that you're exposed to that you just feel are sometimes left out of the conversation when we think about the approach to HIV prevention and HIV support? within the Black community at large, but specifically within the Black queer community? Like, what are some of the stories that you think have kind of been left out, or that you wish people knew or understood more?
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly when I think this applies broadly to much of the Black experience, but particularly to Black queer people, where oftentimes one of the difficulties with telling your story or getting it out there is you often have to explain your context in a way that's a lot more detailed and sometimes laborious compared to
Mhm.
to someone who's not familiar with it. So and I would find myself on this is a story, one something I have personally been through, and I've heard the story countless times where you're trying to explain, oh, well, this is why, we need these services and whatnot. And you might be speaking to a healthcare professional or something like that. But you even just have to explain what being queer looks like, you know,
Mm,
and you have to explain that, no, well, it's not as simple as, I can't just go to my parents necessarily find, and say, oh, well, yeah, just put me on this and it's fine. Like it's no, there's more to it than that,
Right.
and it's
Layers to
sometimes
this.
there's a lack of support and such. And I think that barrier really prevents a lot of kind of these really stories from being told. Where I
mm,
Mhm.
mean, how are you going to talk about, say, a lot of the difficulties you have with accessing, let's say, HIV prevention services, and how
Mhm.
hard that is when it comes to, like, you don't live near anywhere else like that, and you can't,
mm,
and the doctors aren't really culturally competent and whatnot and all
mm,
that. But it's hard to even tell that story to someone who can really disseminate it when
Mhm.
those people also don't understand the context you're talking about at all.
right. I mean, yeah, there's so many layers to what you just said.
Mhm.
Come on. And I think, what my immediate follow up is like, that's why you're so important, I feel, right, to this space, because you do know what the barriers are and you do know what some of the lived experiences are. And this is why we need more representation, even on the research side, right, to be able to bring that insight about why cultural representation is important, or cultural understanding of cultural awareness, just bringing in the lived experiences, so that when we understand what the barriers are, it's not as one, it's not stereotypical, and it allows for nuance, right? Because
Mhm.
I'm wondering, we're in 2025, right? And we're still dealing with some of the same stigmas around HIV that I first learned about 20 years ago as an undergrad. And you would think that we would have come a much further distance away from that stigma, but it seems like it's still there, and it's there in different ways, right? So you mentioned the family as a potential barrier, not a support, right? So can you talk to us a little bit about that, like what the stigma looks like today, what's been the difference, how have things moved or have been reshaped, and maybe what, like, the Black family needs to understand about this stigma, and how to sort of destigmatize this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that while there are some forms of stigma that still persist in a lot of ways, and none of it is 100% gone. I do think there's some ways we've made strides with
Mm-hmm.
openly talking about some of these issues.
True.
I think we're having more open conversations about mental health, for example, more open advertising around things like PrEP and whatnot.
Mhm.
You can see, PrEP ads on the Metro, for example. You can see ads with queer couples being romantic. Um,
Mm,
this was not a thing that was easy to show, let's say, 20 years ago.
true.
So we have made some strides, but there's still so much work to be done. And I think a big part of it is we often aren't having those honest conversations unless they're in a space that is very affirming to begin with.
Mm,
And when you're talking about the family setting, that's not always, and in fact, not often the case. We're talking about for queer kids and queer youth, where even homophobia is still a significant issue, and these ideas around masculinity and now, like, oh, well, gay male son, well, that's not masculine, or you want to dress a certain way, like, oh, you're too feminine, and that kind of gets enforced in many ways. And also, if you have this expectation that, oh, I'm supposed to date girls and be hard and be tough, like, you can't have an honest conversation about sex with your family. Like, that's a barrier that, of course, like, you have to breach those earlier things in order to broach that initial barrier. And so those conversations about things like, hey, I think I might want to get an HIV test, or, I want to start getting routine testing, or, oh, I'm dating someone, let's say, and they may be positive. Like, how do I navigate this? Those conversations rarely happen in a house in a way that is both honest and understanding. I think that's a challenge. 'Cause even from my own family, um, I was somewhat fortunate in that they were more understanding than most, in the sense of they were accepting, and whatnot, but they were not as understanding in terms of actually knowing the things I was talking about. So, I asked them, like, oh, well, should I, get an HIV? Is this something I need? If I'm asking at like 16 years old,
Right.
and then they say, oh my God, you have AIDS? And it's like,
they jumped all the way across the
That would
bridge.
make a lot of parents alarmed, though.
Yeah.
Rasheeta, I mean.
Well, I'm kind of going off script just a little bit, just because I've heard both sides of that conversation. Right? Is it you hear this, and it is, I think we just need to be very vocal about it and upfront. Is like, okay, well, you want me to accept your position, but do you also accept that, some of the hesitancies I might have? Is there like a common ground for us to be in? Like, maybe I don't agree with a lifestyle, but I still love you. And how does that jive with you if someone, say a family member, says like, I love you, and that won't ever change. This has happened so much in my family, with different people who are queer, and some of my family members, like, I love you, but I don't accept the lifestyle. Like, does that is that possible? Is that possible for you in your mind? Like, if you don't accept my lifestyle, I don't think you love me. Can two things exist at once for you in your mind?
I think that, so you can have parents who, they love their kids, but they don't understand, or like they're holding on to some, issues, or some, beliefs that like might not align, and whatnot. But I think the challenge with that is, if you're in that situation, and I'll be honest, I've had family members where that was kind of the dynamic. Like, oh, I love you and you're great, but I don't accept this. Well, our relationship cannot be as honest. That is the inevitable outcome.
Okay.
Because if I know that you don't accept this thing about me,
Mm-hmm.
then why am I going to tell you about, my partner who I'm dating, or why am I going to tell you about like this huge part of your life, and a huge part of my life? And I think it's hard to understand the depth of that type of barrier from, the heterosexual lens, because, you're straight, like, you can say, if you're a woman, you have a husband, and you can talk about your husband with all your friends, and like, it's kind of very passively this thing that, oh, well, obviously this is a core person in my life. But like, when you have that dynamic of, well, I know you don't accept me, I'm shutting off my entire romantic sex, like all that entire part of my life is shut off to you now. And it's
great to know. I mean, that's real. That's real. I had a friend, basically, I asked him the same thing, and he said, well, his mom didn't agree. So literally, like, if he has a partner and she don't stay at his house, or, you know what I'm saying? Like, it's like, I love you, but I'm not kicking my partner out when you come visit type of thing. So sorry, exactly. I didn't mean to cut
and I wonder how that, I'm so glad we're having this conversation, because I do think that is very common amongst Black families, because of different belief systems, whether religious, most of it is from a religious lens. And, people can choose what they want to believe. But I think what, Rod is saying is like, if that's your belief, then this is what that does to our relationship. And you know, how do you get into a state of acceptance and still know that there's love, but it almost feels like rejection, I can imagine, right, Rod? So even though that people are saying, I love you, but I don't agree, you know, how do young people in particular, when they're learning about who they are and accepting who they are, how do they end up moving forward with that information? And then the second part of it is, does the friction or tension in those relationships, especially those family of origin relationships, does that friction impact how they seek help for the different health? Because that's really my interest as a family scientist. And you know, I'm always curious, like, okay, there are hard things that our families are telling us that are difficult for us to hear, because maybe we don't believe in it, or we don't accept it, or we may not have experienced it, right? So you think about like people disclosing about abortions, right? Very unlikely to happen in Black families because of the shame attached to it, the stigma attached to abortion. And yet we know abortions are happening, right? So it's not the same thing by any means, but it's a sort of like, I don't want to tell you more about myself because you're not going to accept that part of me. So now you don't accept that part of me. How does that influence me as a young person who's still learning about life? How does that influence my help seeking and my health information seeking, right? Like, is that type of child more likely to be exposed to HIV transmission, for instance, or are they more likely to go and seek support for PrEP? You see what I'm saying? Like, I just worry about the risk element of that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's one of the big, really negative outcomes that comes out of this. You know, and it's for kids, especially like, you know, teenagers and such. Parents are often the first line of the first line for that type of information.
Absolutely.
And I've seen this story 100 times, you know, many times with some of my own participants in research or my own patients clinically, where, you know, they have parents who are not accepting, you know, and maybe the parents are, you know, they didn't put them out of the house or anything like that, but they say, oh, well, you know, I don't really support like the gay thing. And so what ends up happening is, you know, they don't get any of the information they need because they're like, schools are not teaching about queer sexual health in a very specific way by and large. They're just not, you know, so and they may just, you know, navigate this on their own. And a lot of times that means, you know, they're engaging in riskier practices. They don't know the prevention. And I've seen, I actually had one of my first patients I worked with, you know, he was 18 years old and whatnot. And he just said, you know, I don't even know what an HIV test is. Like, I've never had, like, my parents never talked to me about this, you know, I don't know why. I'm not sure why I would need one. I'm not getting anyone pregnant. So, like, you know, so I was saying, like, they're cultivating that open dialogue really does require acceptance. So I think that's a thing that needs to be worked towards. And,
Wow.
you know, it's not going to happen overnight by any means.
Yeah,
And I
and
think,
I wonder, I mean, I'm thinking about parents that I talk to in my work, and just that they're unlikely to accept that from a religious perspective, right? I mean, there's some work we're doing with faith leaders right now, and maybe there isn't a real middle ground for this. I mean, it sounds like if you don't accept people for who they are and whatever, you know, what they're going through and the risks that are attached to that, then you end up adding to the risk in a negative way, right? It seems like the lack of that support really does influence negative health outcomes. And I just, you know, for me, that's the angle that I try to talk to people about, especially parents of young people, is like, you know, I can understand the tension. I do. I also am concerned about this life right here in front of you, right? And so how do we support, even if it doesn't happen in the family then, right? Like, if the family's not going to be able to support the young person, what are we supposed to do, and how can we support more as a community? Because you know, unless they find those community organizations that you work with, right? You think about how many young people don't have access to that kind of support.
Yeah.
Like, what else can we do on a day to day to support young people um, that may be at risk for different kinds of health outcomes based on the vulnerabilities being related to disparities that impact queer young people?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it, really comes down to one, the community-based organizations pick up a lot of this work really
Mhm.
effectively.
Yeah.
Sometimes, just knowing the resources and being able to link people is really, really useful. I remember, I had a professor who, just kind of liked me. We got along, and she directed me to our queer organization at Howard. Said, "Oh, she thought I would like it," and I did, and it just enters into all these resources. So
Wow.
sometimes linkage
Any
is
shout outs? Any
yes.
shout outs? You can put them
Shout
out
out to
there.
Howard Cascade, like they were fantastic for sure. But
Who was that? I'm sorry, I didn't.
oh, Cascade is what they're called.
Cascade.
Um,
Okay.
Awesome.
Okay. Nice.
Yeah, but yeah, so that's one thing. Also making space for honest and open conversations.
Mhm.
And I think that this is where, like, especially if there is kind of that friction around beliefs and whatnot, you
Mm-hmm.
kind of have to, be a little bit more open and explicit about your openness. That,
Mhm.
hey,
Yeah.
like I just really want us to be able to talk about this, and let's and creating a space that is safe, affirming, so that they're able to have these conversations honestly. Whereas if they feel like, oh, this person, even if they're not a parent, but like, oh, this person, if they find out I'm gay, they're just going to go off, and whatnot,
Mhm.
then they're not going to have that honest conversation with you. But I think making space for those types of conversations and being understanding is also just critical. You know,
I think, as we were listening to this, what are some of the things that you feel Black people in general who are not queer don't understand about what it means to walk this world as a Black queer person? What are some of the myths that you wish were,
yeah.
debunked?
Yeah, so I think, and this is something that both I've, experienced and many of, my colleagues and participants have experienced. But there's always this idea that, I'll put it like this. You ever heard the conversation around like, oh, racism, racism and homophobia and whatnot, and
Mm-hmm.
how those two differ? They function more similarly than I think a lot of Black heterosexual folks like to admit,
Mm-hmm.
or even realize. And I do think that understanding that, oh, the way you walk through these white spaces, and how like you have to code switch sometimes, and we have to,
Mm.
do all of this to like adapt so that we are safe from violence or from socioeconomic damage.
Mhm.
As a Black queer person, I have to do that, but I also have to do that when I go into certain parts of my family. You know,
Mhm.
my Black family, who might parts of that family that might not be as accepting. And I think that if you start to understand that, oh wow, like I'm creating the space that I'm creating
Mhm.
might actually look like the space that my majority white coworkers create for me, which may not be the healthiest thing or the most, easiest thing to walk through. Um, that makes it a lot more. I think it puts things in perspective a little bit more. That, oh
Mhm.
well, this is, I'm doing it, and especially if you're doing it to your own children. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I do think that it's important to understand that you don't want to marginalize your own kids or your own family further, or your own just your own friends and colleagues further as well when it comes to that. And I think that that's really not understood well. And it's not to say that racism and homophobia are exactly the same, but
Right, right.
Right.
they
I
have a
agree.
lot in common with
Absolutely.
how
Yeah.
they affect people's
Yes,
lives.
for
Well,
sure.
I wanted to jump in just with I think a kind of a follow up to some of what you just said, and I was curious to know whether or not when you think of societal in society and within your family, can you think of any stories from your own personal, memory, or from stories that you've heard from others about how that's negatively impacted you? Like, has it prevented you from getting a job, or, economic um, issues that have surfaced from, your sexuality or identity?
Oh,
Um,
oh yeah, absolutely. So I have personally interacted with no fewer than 40 or 50 Black queer people who were kicked out of the house because they were Black and queer,
mm,
or because they were queer, and kicked out of their household. And homelessness. I mean, it's one of the biggest devastators when it comes to any type of subsequent economic outcome. So
absolutely.
at that point, now it's hard to find a job. And now,
Mm,
as far as health, well, hard to get up your treatments when you're trying to find a place to live and, you're out on
absolutely.
the street and you're couch surfing. So, yeah, I
Mhm.
mean, no less than 50. This is
Wow.
astoundingly common, unfortunately.
Wow. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
How do you keep your joy and your perspective on hoping for change when you're dealing with such heavy topics? I know people ask us that a lot because we
Mhm.
all do, in similar health issues. But what do you do to stay, to still have your joy in the midst of just, even that sort of reality of knowing that so many young Black queer folks are homeless or unhoused because their family couldn't reconcile, who they were. And yeah, I can imagine that is traumatic, even if you're just a recipient of that information. So what do you do? What's your, your practice of staying hopeful and staying joyful?
Well, I think one thing that does make me continue to be hopeful is that even with these just rampant, disparities and vulnerability to that type of internal discrimination when it
Mm,
comes from a family setting and such, we have still made a lot of strides.
mm,
Mhm.
We really have. And, I know, especially now, like sometimes when you're facing such backlash, it really doesn't feel that way.
mm.
But I also think of what this looked like 20 years ago, you know,
Right,
Mhm.
right.
and I would say it was worse. It was honestly
Absolutely,
much, much worse.
absolutely.
So, we do just have to keep fighting that fight, and that does make me hopeful. But also, I think it's important to create spaces for joy, even in the midst of strife, with community. So, I think one good thing a lot of these community organizations do is sometimes they just hold fun events, fun
Mhm.
events where a lot of us can just get together, have a
Yeah,
good time, and we need that. I think we all need that in some form of not just Black queer people and Black people at large,
yeah, for
need those
sure.
spaces for joy, just to kind of celebrate yourselves and have a good time, because that also keeps you going through the thick of it. Yeah.
For sure.
Well, in talking about that, I know this is Pride Month, and I wondered if there were particular venues, activities that really kind of speak to that, and who might host those in the city to help bring, that type of joy and hope in community. So, are you planning to do anything special for Juneteenth, or kind of, lighten it up a little bit and kind of talk through those things? And like, are there particular activities and fun opportunities to kind of experience that joy and that hope among people who are kind of like minded, or want to kind of see you win, type of thing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I always do several Pride Month and Juneteenth activities. So
Okay.
I've done World Pride, the past weekend, the weekend before last. I did Baltimore Pride. I'm going to be doing a
Okay.
Juneteenth
All
weekend
right.
coming up. Yes.
Circling, hitting it all.
Well, no, and definitely that's where a lot of this converges. A lot of the
Mm,
organizations in the DMV area here, us helping us stands out.
Mm,
Impulse DC, the Gay Men's Health
mm,
Collaborative,
mm,
Woman Walker does quite a few things, and there are
mm.
other just like really good spaces that are they're health focused, but they also do create these spaces for like oh, we're
Mhm.
going to have like a good discussion, or
Mhm.
movie night, and like just to build that social connection.
Okay.
Yeah, there's those are just a few, but I mean there are plenty more as well.
So once you get involved, you kind of hear about other activities and opportunities. So we'll make sure we put those in the description. If you could share some of those with us, we're
Yeah.
happy to do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I think, when I think about my kids and their generation, um, they're much more like it is what it is kind of conversation. Sure, there's still some, belief systems that are there, but I think they're looking at each other with much more openness
Mm-hmm.
um, than I think I grew up with, or what, we grew up with. And I think that is hopeful just because we know the negative impacts that shutting people out does to their lives, right? And so, how to still be inclusive, even if it's not your walk, right? Like, I think
Mm-hmm.
one of the things to learn from my loved ones who are queer is like, I don't have to walk that walk to
Mm-hmm.
hear what their lives are and to believe what their experiences are and to be supportive. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and in the same way, I feel like, we can be misunderstood as Black women and Black heterosexual women, right? And I think of stereotypes that are so harmful. Um, for queer, what I still hear is that one, they had to have been sexually molested or harmed by someone of the same sex. I think we hear things like, and I want to bring this up because I think it's so harmful and it's still such a big part of conversation and family settings that before a child can even figure out or identify who they are, they've already heard such harmful statements regarding homosexuality that they then shut down completely, or they may even engage in self-harm themselves, right? Which, some of the participants I've worked with have shared things like that. And so it's heavy, but to I want to address some of that. And I would love if you could tell us like how to help parents be mindful of their communication when it comes to this topic, even if their kids have not identified as queer, right? Like what are the tools, what are the ways to be more loving and supportive, even if it's not your journey, even if you don't understand it, even if you may not agree with it, right? Like, but is there a way to still uphold someone's humanity? Because I think without that, we're going to still see a lot of the silenced pain continue. And I would love to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think one important start to this is to kind of not frame queerness as some abnormal change where
Mm,
a lot of time this framed as, oh well, you were straight up until now, like what happened to you to make you like this?
right.
It's like, well, no, many people are this, like, and it's not abnormal for them. It's that's just who they are, and it's fine.
Mhm,
But
mhm,
I think that when you when you talk about it in that way, or you really don't talk about it in that way. So if you don't kind of pathologize it, where you treat it
mhm,
like, oh, well, this is some weird thing that happened to you and who caused it, I think that's a good step.
mhm.
And I think that also it's having a sincerely listening ear can really open you up to just make you a more effective and person to have these honest conversations with. And I think that oftentimes when it comes to conversating with people who may not be as familiar with queer people or don't have many queer friends or whatnot, um, there's almost this it almost feels like a debate, and I don't want it to
Yeah,
feel like a debate. Like I'm like,
right,
oh well, you don't know my experience or
right.
how I got here and like how I walk the world. So give me the space to honestly tell you and
Yeah.
be a listening ear without judgment. Because once you start to do that, one, it does humanize queer people a lot more,
Mhm, mhm,
and it does help build that empathy.
mhm,
I think that's a core part of all of this is learning how to develop that empathy because it's easy to have empathy for people who are like you, you
Right.
know, who are similar to you in many ways. But like,
Mm-hmm.
I think being able to be honest and open, to people who don't have your experience, but to show that empathy, I mean, I think that just opens a lot of positive doors. Sure.
Yeah.
Whew. After all of that, I had you said I'm like writing
I
down
know. I've been
all
writing.
the questions, and I'm trying like to stay within the time realm.
I
But
know.
let me ask just a few things. My first question is,
Mhm.
what is the preferred language? I get that, yeah, even myself. And I'm a part of organization, and it's we're all in there together, right? So
Mhm.
I just sometimes get a little bit reserved about how I speak because I don't want to offend anyone. So is it queer? Is it gay? Same gender loving? I
Yeah.
I just want to be respectful. And
Mhm.
sometimes I know, like my little baby boomer friend, she older, and she's like, honey, I just don't know. I want to say the right thing. I just don't know how people want to be referred to. So that's one of my first questions. Is there a nomenclature, some kind of something that we should be aware of as far as how to refer to people in a respectful way?
Queer is definitely the more accepted kind of overarching term for
Mm,
sexual minority people. It's like gender queer is also used for like trans people and other gender minority people. Um, and then within queer, you have like gay, which are same gender loving, and
mm,
bisexual and other identities. But definitely
okay,
talking about just kind of the queer community is the overarching community. It's
okay.
like, it's kind of an easier shorthand for using the acronym, LGBTQ plus.
Thank
It's
you.
like, oh, like the queer
That's
community.
really
That is
helpful. I
so
never heard it
helpful
explained like that. Yeah.
because in our research, all three of us, we often say MSM, right? Men who have sex with
Mm,
men. And I remember when that shift happened, slightly over a decade ago, and people would ask me, why are you saying men have sex with men? They're gay. And I had to say, not necessarily. Like, if they don't identify as queer or as gay, we're just talking about their sexual behaviors in this particular, context or study or intervention, whatever. So can you share more insight on that too, of like, you know, why we have to have those distinctions? Because I feel like some of those distinctions are also there because of the stigma of saying I'm gay, but yet
mm-hmm.
knowing that I'm engaging in, gender loving sexual activity, right? So like same gender loving. So yeah, I'd love for you to keep going
See,
because
I sparked that little energy. I saw
yeah,
you over there.
Yeah. No, for sure. And definitely, when we think of like queer, like that is identity focused, so
right.
it's about this community's identity and such. When you talk about, say, men who have sex with men, it is very much about the sexual behavior in that
Right.
way.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, it is a situation where, well, there's some internalized homophobia. So someone might say, well, I don't want to say I'm gay, but, I do have
Mm-hmm.
sex with men. Sometimes it's something where they feel like they they're still figuring out their identity in some ways. It's like, oh well, I'm not sure. I want to put a label on it yet, but I am a man who has sex with men.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another reason. And some of that does depend on the specific research question you're focused on. You
Mm-hmm.
know, um, and some of it does depend, and some of it does depend on kind of like if you're talking about a research paper versus like in casual conversation. So I would
Right.
never
It's more of
use
the cat.
MSM in like a
Right.
conversation.
But
Mm-hmm.
But
I do, just to pause you there though, I do feel like even in regular conversations, right? So for instance, with the incident rate of Black women's HIV going up, right? Of transmission of HIV continuously going up. I mean, we've seen this upward trend for a while now. And a lot of that is tied to not only men have sex with men, but it includes that, right? So it will say, do you know if your partner has sex with other men, kind of thing. And so even when we're having regular conversations as girls or, as women hanging out, this comes up, right? In the dating world, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And so what is a healthy way of approaching that conversation? Amongst like young people who are dating and who are learning themselves, and we want to encourage safe sex, but we mean that in the largest, most in comprehensive sense, right? So what is the most what are the phrases, or the what should the conversation sound like when it's like that?
Yeah. So, I definitely think that anytime, when it comes to even just partners or meeting people you're getting close to and whatnot, if you want to ask about identity and such, you can ask about identity. That's fine.
Right,
Just say like,
right.
and while making space that, there's no judgment here, but I want to have this
Right.
conversation. That's fine.
Right.
Now, I think that when it starts getting into the HIV risk component, it starts to obscure a few things.
Okay.
So if the concern is HIV risk, then I think you just have a conversation directly about that. So
Okay.
ask about, hey,
Okay.
have you ever had an HIV test? Can we get tested together or whatnot? Because I feel like, and this is not everyone, but I do feel like this is a common thing where people say, "Oh, well, I want to know if my man has ever had sex with a man, so I can be safe from
Right.
HIV." But
Mhm.
okay, while that bridging does happen, a lot of women do get HIV from their
From
heterosexual partners,
heterosexual, that's right.
and in part because a lot of heterosexual men just never get tested ever.
Mhm.
Right.
Like, and so they'll have HIV. Sometimes they'll have HIV for years and years, and just not the thought of an HIV test never enters their head.
True.
So if it's about HIV risk, then talk about HIV
Right.
risk.
Yes,
That
I love that.
exactly.
I love
Yeah,
that
that's
advice.
amazing. I agree. I so this is a little. Yeah, I asked the kind of quirky questions if you have if you haven't noticed. So I hope you don't mind. I kind of get in there.
No, I'm here for it.
I will say the media has it's quite sensationalized um, this concept of, like you said, that masculinity element with the hip hop culture and this Diddy trial, and then bringing in a lot of his sexuality with this kind of, I guess that was more closeted. And so I was a little curious about, and I don't know if there's a true connection to this question, but is there some internal kind of frustrations within the queer community with certain types of personalities, like those who might be a little bit more flamboyant, or kind of heightening some stereotypes about like how male person who is gay might be perceived, like extremely flamboyant, etc. So I don't know if I've clearly asked that question, but is that there like some internal frustrations with maybe some extreme personalities that kind of perpetuate some of the stereotypes? I guess.
So I don't think there's, at least not in a broad community sense, I don't think there's really frustration with the extreme or flamboyant personalities.
Okay.
In fact, there's been, I think, much more of a movement for, at least internally, of kind of like trying to uplift, our more feminine presenting brothers, and whatnot,
Okay.
because, that's a part of our community. And,
Mhm.
oftentimes we've been so really just so enforced into the hyper masculine role. Like, oh, if
Mhm.
you're a man, you have to be the hardest man possible. And speaking
Mhm.
of hip hop has
Mhm.
enforced a lot of that
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
So it's kind of nice to see that, we're now talking about more uplifting, our feminine, community members and whatnot, and that femininity is beautiful in all its forms.
Mhm.
And it's also nice because it just helps us accept each other a lot more in that way. I think where frustrations do arise is when queer people are all assumed to present a particular way.
Right.
Mm.
And usually that assumption is that, every queer man like is very visibly feminine and whatnot.
Mhm.
Or they speak this way, they like wear
Mhm.
this and wear that, and
Right.
like just like black folk are not a monolith, black queer
Yeah.
folk
Neither
are
are
also
black,
not a
exactly.
monolith.
Yeah.
And we do have all these different we have many different presentations, we live many different lifestyles.
Mhm.
True.
And so I think that just understanding that,
Just
but I don't
human.
think that's a frustration with our flamboyant personalities.
Okay.
Mhm.
No,
And I
that's
think
very helpful. Yeah. Excellent. Go ahead, Rochelle, because I'll take over now. Go ahead.
No, I
I
love it.
got another question over
No,
here.
no. Go for it. I'm really kind of actively listening.
Yeah, no. I just had one other question. I think it may lend itself to this. What you just talked about is that I know culturally that there's this starting to become a movement or openness to like poly and fluid lifestyles, and so maybe kind of appending to some of what Rochelle said about women. Like that's my space, HIV and prevention among Black women. And so just kind of, you know, in your experience, how has that movement toward just like poly and fluid kind of played out in the Black queer space?
Oh yeah, so definitely it's still kind of somewhere that's trending towards like more acceptance. And in many ways, I think it's a part of this larger trend towards Black queer people engaging in the relationships we really and sincerely want, you know.
Mm,
And so, you know, for many of us, like, you know, if monogamy is often a social expectation, it's the idea that, oh, well, it has to look this way, and, you know, and if because that's just what all relationships are. But
mm-hmm,
um, in reality, no, that's not what all relationships are, and we don't have to model our own relationships after that. So
mm,
some of us are monogamous, you know, fully monogamous and whatnot. Some of us love open relationships. Some of us like poly relationships.
mm-hmm,
But it really is, there is a growing movement towards kind of the freedom of defining the relationship that you and your partner want.
mm,
In a lot of ways, I think it's an extension of even just accepting our queerness, where
mm,
there was a time where, you know, a common narrative was, well, you know, two men is not a real relationship. So eventually you're going to like, you know, need to settle down with some woman or whatnot,
mm-hmm,
you know, and we have slowly gotten away from that, you know, over the past several decades. So
mm-hmm.
I think this is just that extension of, no, we're going to have the relationships we actually want, you know. Mhm,
Fair enough. Fair enough.
mhm.
Awesome. This has been such a great conversation, truly enlightening.
Mm-hmm.
And just we hope it's been open for people to learn and to listen and to ask more informed questions when.
Wait, Rochelle, what can I have
Before
one
we
more
wrap
question?
up,
One
okay.
more question. I'm so sorry, Rod. Just
Well, no, it's
I was
fine.
curious. I think I would be remiss not to ask this with the current kind of political infrastructure. Is there any fears that you've experienced with
Great
people
question.
that you engage with lately? And how can the community kind of help to create that safe space so that you don't feel like you're being crushed by just the current systems that are kind of evolving right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and certainly there are fears around a loss of resources when it comes to not just things like healthcare, but housing, like, you know,
Yeah,
things like economic opportunities. And sadly, much of that is and continues to come to fruition.
yeah,
There's a fear of this cultural shift where, you know, there is this more open homophobia,
Right.
mm-hmm.
more, you know, in many ways and whatnot. And that is a concern. Like it's, you know, a concern that comes up very regularly.
Yeah,
And, you know, I think that now more than ever, our community spaces are so important. You
mm-hmm.
know, our pride, you know, and pride broadly, like not just like queer pride, but also like things
Right,
like
of course.
Juneteenth and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Our celebrations of ourselves are very important. And our political activism is very important.
Mm-hmm.
And I strongly encourage us towards all of those. You know, I mean, that, you know, I always get students who sometimes ask, like, oh, well, you know, you were in the civil rights movement. Well, you know, what would you have done if you were in the civil rights movement? And maybe about 8 years ago, I said, well, we're in one now.
Right,
Now I say, oh, we're really in one now.
right.
You know,
You living it every day, darling. Okay.
you know,
Our civil liberties are under attack
yeah. So
for
Yeah.
sure.
we have to
Mm-hmm.
fight, like, and
Mhm.
that type of activism is so important, and that can take a lot of different forms.
Mm-hmm.
Donating to, you know, appropriate causes, you know, political causes and such, protesting visibly,
Mm-hmm.
you know, there are many ways to be an activist, but I think now more than ever is the time that, we have to fight for these rights that we have worked so hard to build up.
Right. Exactly. Thank you for that. I'm gonna be quiet now with questions.
No,
I know you were wrapping up, Rochelle, but I was like, oh no.
no.
And there is a special. I gotta
I'm
put it out there. There's
I'm
a special
so
election
glad
in
you asked
Georgia.
that.
Yeah, there's a special election in Georgia today, so I've been encouraging people to vote. Yes, it's our commission on our electric bills. Local things are important. The prices
Absolutely.
and who governs that. So just want to
Yeah.
shout out. Yeah, please go vote when
No,
it's time for you to vote.
yes, vote with humanity and consideration of people that may not be going through what you're going through, but that this could impact them even more. So I am really grateful for this rich and honest conversation. I'm grateful for just, the life that you shared with us, Rod, and your expertise, your perspectives, all of that. We need more of this kind of dialogue in our communities and our families. So we hope that we've been able to model something, right? Because Rasheeta and I were like, we literally I work with Rod, right? And Rasheeta does this work, but there's still so much that we want to learn more about, so that we're making sure to be respectful and kind to fellow human beings. So thanks for sharing with us and teaching us at the same time.
Absolutely.
So is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with, whether it's a word of encouragement, a call to action, or anything that's still on your heart?
Yeah, I think the last answer was the call to action in a lot of ways. But no, it's no, I'm definitely happy to be on the podcast. It was a great discussion, so really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And to our listeners, join us for the next episode. We hope you enjoy. Please leave comments and let us know what you want to hear more of. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Take care.